to the rodeo to see Zac Brown Band.
This Texas teacher, once a beloved chair of the English department, now faces sexual assault allegations dating back to 2007. Prosecutors say she sexually assaulted a female student for multiple years.
It's less about the same sex nature of this, because it's who you prefer, right? I think, in my opinion, it's more about the fact that they are prosecuting this teacher, even though 15 years has passed.
Former CIA officer and FBI agent Tracy Walder says this case could mean big things for other sexual assault survivors, even decades after their abuse.
That's something that is rare and that we haven't seen a lot. And I think this could really set an interesting precedence if in terms of students feeling comfortable that they could come forward and things like this. I think that's the interesting part of this case, is that it is being prosecuted, and we haven't seen that a lot.
The investigation into Brandyn Hargrove began in September of last year, when authorities were first tipped off about the alleged abuse. At the time, she was put on administrative leave from her position at Brazoria High School in Clute, Texas, about an hour south of Houston. The district released a statement reading in part, quote, "BISD remains dedicated to upholding the highest standards of professionalism and integrity among our staff, and we take the safety and well-being of our students very seriously. We understand that this news may raise concerns." Months later, a grand jury indicted Hargrove on 12 counts, including 6 counts of sexual assault of a child, 4 counts of indecency with a child by contact, 2 counts of indecency with a child by exposure. The incidents date back to 2007. Police say Hargrove sexually assaulted the girl multiple times when she was 15 to 17 years old. The survivor came forward in September of this year. What would make her come forward now, more than 15 years later?
I mean, there's a whole host of different things, right? Sexual abuse, sexual assault, those are all really difficult things to come to terms with, I guess. Those are all difficult things, I think, to talk about. Those are all difficult things to share with people. And so, I think at that time, the person was not in a place where they felt comfortable discussing it, comfortable reporting it. And so I think that's why.
After her days in the FBI and CIA, Walder became a teacher working at the Hockaday School in Dallas. She says an eerily similar incident happened while she was at the school.
I'm pretty well versed in this because it happened at the same school that I taught at. In that 21 years later, a student came forward and accused an English teacher of an inappropriate relationship with her. And the English teacher was working actually at a different school at that time in California, and she resigned from her position there as well. But the case was never prosecuted. And part of why that student took a while, in that case, 2 decades, right? In this case, less than that, was that the person was having issues grappling with their own sexuality and, coming out to their family. And so you have sexual abuse, right? Which obviously is extremely difficult for a teenager or child or anyone really to talk about. And then on top of that, you have someone who is potentially dealing with a situation that their family may not be accepting of their sexuality on top of that. And so I think, yes, all of those things can combine to make it take a long time.
In that case, a former student came forward in 2014, accusing a former English teacher of abuse dating back to 1987. Walder says charges weren't brought in that case, but with Hargrove's case as an example, other sexual assault survivors may feel safe coming forward. So, if these cases have been happening all along, and there's no statute of limitations, is it possible that other teachers across the country could face similar charges in decades-old cases?
That's why I think that this case is going to set an interesting precedent. Because, look, in that case I mentioned to you before, that was 21 years old, that teacher became head of a school afterwards and should have never been allowed, right, to continue. My hope is now that these cases are being prosecuted, yes, more and more people will come forward and less of these teachers will be able to continue their careers in the classroom, thus, shutting the door for them to have an opportunity to potentially abuse more.
Hargrove was arrested in late December and booked into the Brazoria County Jail. She was released the same day after posting $240,000 bond.
We have seen instances of same-sex abuse. I mean, it really doesn't discriminate, right? And then we have seen times where people have taken decades to come forward.
But it's the date of the alleged abuse that will make for a tricky investigation. Now, another part of this, I'm wondering if it'll be difficult to prove that this happened given the time lapse from this alleged incident, these incidents as a whole, and then when the charges are brought this year.
Right. I think that's where obviously these things can be difficult. In the case of that one teacher that I had explained before, where that happened, in the late 80s and 90s, they actually opted not to move forward with charges because they didn't feel it had turned into a she said kind of situation. And that can absolutely happen in a case like this. However, I think they are probably, since they are pursuing charges in this case, I assume I'm just hypothesizing that they may have technology might be their friend in a case like this. Cell phones, again, weren't around in the 80s, but they were around in 2007. And so they may have messages on cell phones. They may have emails. They also may have witnesses who are willing to come forward now, even though time has passed, and talk about what they saw, what they heard, about interactions between the two of them. So that's what I suspect they'll be using in terms of evidence in this case.
Law&Crime has reported on more than a dozen similar cases where a teacher sexually assaulted a student. In several cases, investigators use cell phone data to bolster the case, whether it be with explicit photos or videos or by cell phone messages and tracking. That's what investigators did in the case of Cassidy Krause, an Iowa high school teacher who was accused of sending students explicit photos via social media and having relations with at least 3 of them. Investigators also found photographic proof on the phone of social worker Peyton Shires, who was eventually arrested and charged with unlawful sexual contact with a minor in Ohio. Prosecutors there say Shires had sex with a 13-year-old boy who she'd been assigned to counsel. Investigators found the images on the boy's phone. In Hargrove's case, more than 15 years have passed, and along with it, countless technological updates. But Walder says it's still possible for investigators to learn something from a cell phone.
It depends. It depends on whether or not, you may have a situation where the student decided to actually hold on to all of those. I've seen that happen before. The student probably felt traumatized and victimized at the time, maybe wasn't sure what they wanted to do about that, and may have kept this information for that long. We don't know. Yes, might data recovery be difficult in a situation like this? Of course. As you mentioned, it's a completely different cell phone platform than what we're operating on today. But I do think that this may be an instance where the student felt that they were being victimized and maybe knew that this was wrong, was not in a headspace where they felt that they could come forward or was comfortable coming forward, but held on to this, which would be absolutely incredible if that was the case.
If we're talking about evidence from way back then, texts, messages, things like that, I think about I have kept a journal since I was 8. So let's say that this survivor kept a journal back in high school when it was happening. Could something like that even be brought in as evidence?
I think it absolutely could be brought in as evidence. It's all circumstantial. Obviously, it wouldn't be, firsthand eyewitness testimony, but it would absolutely be used as evidence. I also think it would be used as an investigative tool in all of this as well, to sort of point them in the right direction. Because if this student kept a journal, maybe they mentioned friends that saw this happening. Maybe they mentioned other adults that they saw, and so those people could all be forced to speak.
Is it possible that someone way back when, in 2007, around when this was happening, saw something and didn't come forward or didn't even realize what they saw was something nefarious?
So that's actually exactly what happened in the case of the Castilleja school, which I had mentioned about before. Is a lot of individuals did ultimately come forward. I think at the time it maybe didn't register. It was sort of a folklore, I guess, around the school, if you will, or maybe it wasn't taken seriously, but they did ultimately come forward. So yes, that's highly possible.
Walder says witness testimony will be helpful in the case against Hargrove, but it will likely be the testimony of the survivor herself that will help yield a conviction. And in this case, do you think it's paramount that the accuser herself comes forward and testifies?
In my opinion, yes. But I never want to compel someone who's been the victim of abuse, right? That's such a delicate subject. I think it would be very beneficial in regards to moving the case forward and getting an outcome that she wants. But I would imagine that they're being rather delicate about this and trying to build a case that doesn't hinge solely on her testimony.
Just this week, Hargrove's district held an emergency meeting voting to terminate her from the school altogether. For now, though, she'll stay on paid administrative leave until the board takes a final action to terminate her contract. That's expected at an upcoming meeting on January 22nd. Reporting for Law&Crime, I'm Gillespie.